The year is 1959, and there's a fork in the road for Pontiac V8. They would essentially choose to go down three different paths with their V8 engine as far as journal size is concerned. The crankshaft journal is also called the crankpin or rod bearing journal. It is a mechanical device inside the engine which connects the crankshaft to the connecting rods for each cylinder. To look at it in a different way, the crankshaft is the name given to the whole shaft. The rod bearing journal is the point where the connecting rod connects to the crankshaft. Pontiac V8 had three sizes of rod bearing journals. 2.249 inches in diameter, and that size was used on all of the engines up until the 389 and 400. For the 389 and 400, the rod bearing journals would increase to 3 inches. Displacement size would shrink, and they would go back to the 2.249 inch diameter main rod bearing journals, except for the 421, 428, and 455. They used the largest rod bearing journal, which was 3.25 inches. In this episode, we are only covering the large journal engines and the 389 SD. All of the small and mid-range journals are covered in a separate video, which came out yesterday, which I'll link right here. And I'll also put the link in the description. But as a little bit of a refresher, Pontiac's V8 was ready by 1953, but Buick and Chevrolet would complain to the corporate heads of General Motors to let Buick offer theirs first and put a 2-year hold on Pontiac so Chevy had enough time to develop a V8 of their very own. The Pontiac V8 was a stout block design, to say the least, and it didn't follow the big block, small block mold that a lot of General Motors engines did. There was only one block size that went from 265 all the way up to 455 cubic inch displacement. Overhead valve arrangement that features rocker arms on ball pivots on studs set inside the cylinder head instead of using a separate rocker shaft. The cam inside the engine would actuate a lifter. Most of them were hydraulic, but there was some mechanical lifters used in this engine series, would actuate the push rod. Valves would open and close on the pivot action of the rocker arms. This engine series uses full pressurized oil and lubrication system, shooting a steady stream of oil to all of the critical components inside the engine from 4 oil galleries, 2 inside the cylinder block and 1 in each of the cylinder heads. Super Duty was Pontiac's super high performance engine program, and we have to talk about this person, a character in history that goes by the name of Henry Unick, but best known as Smokey Unick. In life, you meet people and you meet characters. Smokey was a character. His trademark look was the white uniform with the battered cowboy hat with a cigar or corncob pipe. He got his start in NASCAR, which was the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing. Unick would get in with a local stock car racing team owner, Marshall Teague. Yes, that Marshall Teague. Unick was a good mechanic, but he didn't have any experience with stock car racing until joining Teague's team. Unick would tune the Hudson Hornet, which is what Marshall Teague raced. They used a 308 cubic inch displacement flathead 6. The race engines were called the 7X, and they sound nothing like any other 6-cylinder you've ever heard before. Take a listen to this one. Anyway, with Unick's help, they were able to win the Southern 500. From the years of 1958 through 1973, Unick would be involved with the Indianapolis 500. Unick would evolve into one of the best car engine / car innovators, as well as interpreter of the rules in the sport of NASCAR. VinWiki has some incredible stories of him. I literally laughed out loud when I heard them. I don't have any affiliation with them, but they're just such cool stories that I'll link it in the description. I think everybody should hear them. He was one of a kind, and they just don't make characters like that anymore. Unick would work with many different automotive brands during his time in NASCAR: Hudson, Chevy, Ford. Unic would join Pontiac's racing division in 1959. Unic was the force behind the Pontiac Super Duty engine program. The SD engines had upgraded internals to go racing with, whether that was on the drag strip or making a left-hand turn on the oval track. These were the cream of the crop, chef's kiss, that Pontiac offered. SD versions came in 389, 421, and 455. The 389 got a Super Duty package in 1960, and it was offered until 1962. It got internal upgrades such as, but not limited to, 4-bolt main bearing caps, forged steel crankshaft, and forged connecting rods. There was another 389 engine option known as the 420A, Tempest 389, which was offered from 1959 through 1962, and it produced up to 348 horsepower with 3 two-barrel carburetors, better known as tri-power. The Super Duty version of the 421 was available as a secret menu option on the full-size Pontiacs from 1961 late 1961 through 63. Sources conflict on the standard 421 when it was available either in 63 or 64, but both the Super Duty version and the standard version were offered until 1966. The 421 V8 was cast differently than all of the other previous blocks, using a thinner wall casting, making the engine lighter in the process. Water ports going from the head to the intake manifolds were slightly changed, so the 1961 and later manifolds will not work on earlier engines and vice versa. So, what set the Super Duty apart from the standard 421 included but not limited to: the camshaft was a McKellar number 10 with 308/320 degrees of duration. They were using solid lifters. The standard 421 used hydraulic lifters. Forged steel connecting rods, forged aluminum Mickey Thompson pistons, forged steel crankshaft, high pressure heavy duty oil pump with larger 8-quart oil sump, as well as 4-bolt main bearing caps. 421 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 6.9 liters. The standard version made anywhere between 320 to 356 horsepower, around 4,800 RPM. But the Super Duty version, it could make anywhere between 353 all the way up to 405 horsepower, which some still say that that is even a conservative number. Many believe that it can make up to 465 horsepower at 5,600 RPM, 459 pound-feet, or 622 Newton meters at 4,400 RPM, with a bore of 4.09375 inches and a stroke of 4 inches. Compression could be anywhere between 1075 all the way up to 12. The standard engine was only available from 1963 through 1966, whereas the Super Duty was available from 61 through 66. It's also important to note that there was an experimental Pontiac overhead cam 421 V8 made by McKellar, which will get its own episode one day. In 1970, Pontiac would bore the 428 to 4.15 inches, and they would also increase the stroke to 4.21 inches, bringing overall displacement to 455 cubic inch displacement, making this the largest displacement engine in Pontiac's V8 engine family. It was offered in standard, high output, and Super Duty. 455 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 7.4 liters. It's good for anywhere between 200 to 335 horsepower at 4,000 RPM, and those numbers might sound kind of small considering how big this engine is, but you have to remember, those are more than likely net horsepower figures. In the early 70s, we went from gross horsepower, or horsepower with absolutely no accessories attached that rob horsepower, best world figures, to more net horsepower with all of the power robbing accessories attached to the engine. It could make up to 500 pound-feet or 678 Newton meters at 3,600 RPM, with a bore of 4.15 inches and a stroke of 4.21 inches. Compression was 8.2 to 1. This engine was used from 1970 through 1976. The HO, or high output versions, got different heads, reinforced block, The SD 455 or Super Duty version was only available from 1973 through 1974. Emissions would ultimately kill this engine for the 1975 model year. Cylinder block was strengthened with 4-bolt main bearing caps, nodular iron crankshaft, forged connecting rods, forged aluminum pistons, high flow cylinder head. The camshaft had duration of 301/313 degrees of duration. The 455 would ultimately be discontinued for the 1977 model year because of emissions. They would move on to produce more efficient engines, but Pontiac would cancel their V8 engine line entirely after the year 1981, and they would just use V8s from other General Motors branches. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. 2 scenarios today. Which one of these would you rather have? Late model year 1961 Pontiac Catalina with the 421 SD, or 1964 Pontiac Grand Prix with the 421 SD, or 1968 Pontiac Bonneville with the 428. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario. 1971 Pontiac 455 Firebird Trans Am high output 455, or 1967 Pontiac Catalina 421 Super Duty, or 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge with the 455 in it. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band, the song title, and the lyric that comes next will have their comment pinned to the top of it. I don't know why she's riding so high. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this one. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below, or you could always send me an email at what_its_like@yahoo.com. Thanks again for everything. What engine episodes would you like to see covered this year on this channel? Put it in the comment section below, and until next time, toodaloo!